In combat sports, such as boxing, kickboxing, and MMA, the stakes to your well-being are probably higher than any other sport. You may hear common preaches, such as, fighting is just a sport. But it's just not that simple. Fighting is beyond sport, it is beyond competition. It is hand-to-hand combat. It is often compared to a game of chess, but it's not just like a game of chess. It's a violent game of chess with physical consequences to it. In the sport of fighting, a loss here and there does not only affect your ego, but more importantly, it can affect your physical well-being, both in the short term and the long term. Therefore, preparation is of extreme importance in fighting. Nothing can be left for chance. All affectable parameters must be worked on. Every fighter that has ever stepped into a ring has made peace with the fact that something may go wrong, and they have in all likelihood contemplated on how to best mitigate the chances of this occurring. They want to be prepared in every way possible. And one of those coping mechanisms is to construct a persona, similar to the facade of a building or like a mask worn by a theatrical performer. According to Carl Jung, this is the side that you display to the public. In his own words, it is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. But why, you may ask? Why would you deliberately want to hide who you are fundamentally? And how does a persona prepare you for a fight? We will go into this later. What is the first thing that comes to mind? For many, it is probably an immunity to fear. Perhaps one of the biggest, and may I even say the most unfair notions in the community of combat sports is that competitive fighters are mythological creatures completely devoid of human factors. We believe that they are Greek gods immune to day-to-day emotions such as fear, sadness, and anxiety. Simply because one fights for a living, gets bloodied up every now and then and performs in front of thousands of spectators, they simply cannot feel fear, right? It could not have been further from the truth. As long as you are human and free from psychopathy, you will feel emotions. It is not your profession that determines what emotions you feel. It is simply a matter of being human. The intensities may vary between different people, but they will all feel emotions. When Cus D'Amato trained Mike Tyson, he always wanted Tyson to be in tune with his relationship with fear. According to him, it was not a matter of repressing your fear, but controlling it. If you observe the most popular fighters in sports such as boxing and MMA, you will come across some very entertaining characters. They will often appear as larger than life, and you will almost never see them actively showing any form of weakness. Many times during the press conference and the media, they will say things that appeal to you, often in conjunction with humor and wit. Despite all of this, there is just this hunch in you that they are simply not being themselves, they are not being authentic. Something feels off. Why are they trying so hard, you may think to yourself. They just appear too perfect. It doesn't feel human, you may think. And you having this hunch is no coincidence, because oftentimes they are not showing you the self, they are showing you the persona. Imagine the persona as a form of a facade to a building. You are only seeing what's on the outside. You may see some beautiful windows, some beautiful columns, a strong and resilient roof that can handle any weather condition. What you are not seeing, however, is what's on the inside. You will have to get a bit closer to observe this. And obviously a fighter with a lot at stake will not allow you to get too close, because they don't want to be found out. And by all means, a persona is often used to generate traction, and truth be told, it is a very effective tool for that purpose. However, the real purpose goes a bit deeper than that. It is, as Jung stated, a protective mechanism. The early signs of a persona begins in childhood. A child will learn which behaviors will lead to punishment and which ones will lead to approval. In the words of Carl Jung, therefore, a persona has two purposes. Number one, to make a specific impression on other people. And number two, to conceal the individual's inner self from other people's prying eyes. In many day-to-day situations in social life, therefore, you will often put on a persona. If you work at a retail store, you will most likely put on a persona to appear pleasant to customers. When you're at work with your co-workers, you may want to put on an impression that you're a cool and sociable guy, and this might lead you to getting invited into social events and such. And in contrast to that, you may not want to display behaviors that may lead to disapproval or being left out in such a setting. For example, being overly complaining, putting everyone down, being too aggressive or apathetic. Likewise, fighters with millions of spectators and fans all over the world, they too have their impression that they want to make. They want to display themselves in the best light possible also, and they too have their fears of being found out. Carl Jung continues by saying, "In any case, the temptation to be what one seems to be is great because the persona is usually rewarded in cash." Does all of this sound familiar? How many times throughout sports history have we seen this repeated? In Freud's view, we naturally have certain desires. We have desire for power, security, shelter, love, intimacy, and even a desire for aggression at some times. They all come in different forms. Now here's the thing, he continues. It is not always possible for us to act out to obtain those desires. And obviously when living in an urban society, it may prove consequential for you to even admit those publicly. And to a certain extent, this is obviously a good thing, otherwise the world would be chaos. As a natural consequence then, you will unconsciously repress those desires, and in turn, they become sort of prisoners of the mind. This will then keep building up like a pressure cooker. Carl Jung referred to this repressed aspect of yourself as the shadow side. If this is then continued without being brought to light, it builds up, and it often expresses itself as guilt. When we meet a psychologist due to those repressed emotions, people often have a sense of guilt that they have a hard time explaining. This guilt, Freud explains, is motivated by something he called fear of loss of love, which can express itself as a form of social anxiety. What does this mean exactly? Suppose you're with your classmates and you have opinions about certain things, which you're afraid of expressing, with the fear of being excluded, for instance. Not only this, you may even feel a shame for having those opinions in the first place, so you repress them. In a fighter's instance, this fear of loss of love may be evident by displaying any form of inherent weakness, so they will naturally want to display themselves as strong, assured, and confident. And this may be done for several reasons, including the fear that the opponent might exploit you for displaying those weaknesses, or the fear that they will lose their fan base. Whether you want to publicly flaunt your thoughts, desires, and emotions, that is up to you. But one thing is certain, you will compromise your well-being if you repress them and deny their existence. This is where the danger arises. You don't have to publicly flaunt them, but repressing them is not an option either. The shadow can quite simply be described as qualities that are opposites to those of your persona. And just like a real shadow, it is with you all the time. It will follow you wherever you go, for it is a part of you that you cannot remove. The mere thought of being rejected for a bad aspect of ourselves, as we perceive, is something that we naturally dread. It is often said that after death, our biggest fear is rejection, and it only serves as a defense mechanism to hide those from the public. This process is done unconsciously, meaning you are not even aware that you are doing it in the first place. To defend ourselves against this emotional baggage that comes with being rejected or found out, we resort to many strategies known as ego defense mechanisms in psychology. Common strategies include repression, denial, and projection. In addition to repressing those undesirable qualities about ourselves, we also deny their mere existence and we project them onto others. And as we briefly went through earlier, controlling your desires is a necessary process. If everyone acted out as they desired, anarchy would be the result and it would lead to absolute chaos. But as we will go through later, it is not a matter of acting out on one's shadow side. This is a big distinction, but it is a matter of accepting and admitting it to oneself. This is a major difference that you must be aware of. You can liken the act of repression to that of a pressure cooker. If you keep repressing aspects about yourself without any form of introspection, the pot will eventually burst. And as we will go through later, this can have tremendous consequences not only on a personal level, but also a societal level, as history has shown. Carl Jung once said, "A man who is possessed by his own shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. Whenever possible, he prefers to make an unfavorable impression on others. In the long run, luck is always against him, because he is living below his own level, and at best only attains what does not suit him, and if there is no doorstep for him to stumble over, he manufactures one for himself." To push down and hide your true self takes a tremendous amount of energy, and it ultimately contributes to a great amount of chronic fatigue. Life will simply take more effort. Every social interaction will cost 10 times the energy that it has to, and you will never feel truly free. There are many possible outcomes, depression probably being one of them. But also, more importantly, it leads to destructive tendencies, either on a personal or worse yet an intrapersonal level, that is towards others. When done towards others, it is known as projection. If you ever find yourself irritated by someone's behavior without an apparent or rational reason, it may sometimes be an indication of something you might actually have yourself, or something that you are repressing about yourself. Projection can have severe consequences on a societal level, especially when it is done by a big figure of authority with massive power and influence. Large-scale projection has been employed by conquerors and dictators throughout history, and they would later convince others to partake in projecting their shadow through the use of propaganda. This is to a large extent the basis of many wars and genocides throughout history. When a psychologist meets with a patient, one of the most difficult tasks is to get the patient to confront the shadow side. After years of repression, hiding, and denying, this can be a frightening experience. However painful the process may be, this is probably the right course of action, for you will tap into a new potential that you never knew existed. If one does not shine light into one's shadow side, one will go through life with a certain emptiness, resentment, a lack of purpose, because one is not living according to the self. Stories of people coming into terms with their shadow side indicates a greater vitality for life, a tremendous relief, and a more vigorous and creative approach to life. After years of repression, when one talks to a skilled therapist that points out one's repressed sides that were previously unconscious to the patient will then feel a massive baggage being lifted. A big and very detrimental misconception is that coming into terms with your shadow is ethically wrong, for the lack of a better term, because you're shining light on perhaps twisted attributes about yourself, perhaps making you more prone to acting out on those. It could not have been further from the truth. By you actively shining light on your shadow, you are taking responsibility for it, meaning you will become less compulsive and ethical decision-making becomes a possibility. In essence, it is you who will be controlling your shadow rather than the opposite. Quite the contrary, the real danger is if you ignore those sides about yourself, for then the shadow will be controlling you.